All right. Well, welcome to another podcast here at the Living Stream Studio. My name's David Stockton, and they're letting me drive this thing today. Woo! We got Dalton in the backseat as always, and we have actually something real special and new. Tim, the tool man Hesman, is here, and he's going to be joining us for this ride. Alec, who is normally on this, is actually on his way to Bali to do a missions trip there. And he was the one that preached the message last Sunday. So basically, we get to, say whatever we want, which is like a total free day here. Yeah. But little introduction on Tim. I was trying to think of what are the words to describe Tim. And obviously, you have Tim the swole. Is that what the word we landed on? Tim is just, he's burly. He's strong. He's done gymnastics his whole life, still teaches gymnastics and all of that. So he's able and strong. Tim is also a true theologian. He really does love studying. He was just talking about how he took 7 years of Latin and he's trying to keep that fresh and alive so he can continue to read old things.
Yes.
Which is fun. And Tim is also, he's kind of a golden boy around here. We call him the golden boy. He does everything really well. And he's got golden hair, golden skin, golden eyes. They are golden eyes. Oh my goodness, I didn't know that. It's true. He is 007, golden eye.
Whoa.
That's an old school joke. Nobody? Am I on my own on that one?
Yeah, that was way before our time.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's an old video game reference.
Oh, I know the game.
Yeah.
But I thought you were talking about the source material, from the 60s. Not that you were born in the 60s.
You're calling me 60s now?
No. I'm not. I'm not.
I'll take it, man. I'll take it. So Tim also just had a major surgery. Tell us about your surgery.
Yeah. So I just had a very large surgery. It was on my jaw because I had a benign tumor growing in my jaw.
Benign, love that word.
Yes, which that was a huge thing to get back from the labs when they said that was officially benign. Yeah. It was growing in there for a long time. We're not quite sure how long, but it was painful, and so we went into the hospital, and the surgery entailed getting a cross-section of my jaw cut out and removing that piece of the bone, and then cutting a long incision down the side of my leg, and pulling out most of my fibula and shaping that. And most of it. So I've got 6 centimeters up top, a lot of bone. 6 centimeters down below, or something like that. But yeah, most of the middle of it. So they took that out, and while they were down there, they took the artery and the vein because the bone needs blood supply, and then they shaped it and put it in my jaw with a nice titanium plate that's nice and long. And then they had to have a large incision that runs from here to here, and they flipped that up so they could connect the artery and the vein into my neck, and they closed that up. So it was 30 stitches in my neck and 35 staples in my leg. And it was, just about 7 weeks ago.
It looks so, that incision. I remember when you first showed it to me.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, but it's barely even noticeable.
Yeah, they did such a fantastic job.
And you got a titanium jaw now?
That's right.
MMA, here we come.
I'm ready.
He was already superhuman before.
I know. And now
he's even more
titanium
superhuman. He's the perfect specimen for some government super soldier, I feel like.
Yeah. And how long you been married now?
Coming up on 2 years in July.
Yeah, a little shout out to Taryn.
Absolutely. So that's such
Taryn
a
is also super awesome and theological.
Yes, a theologian as well.
Which is fun. And so, let's get into Daniel.
Let's do it.
Yeah. We're going through the series, Strange Land. Tried to say it as strange as I could.
Yeah, I remember last week you guys were trying to add a little sound effect to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do that.
I don't know if we're up on the sound effects. We just
I can this time.
We just say
we'll
sound
put it right
effects.
here. Perfect. Okay. Yeah.
So Strange Land. We did a little bit of Jeremiah. Ryan kicked it off with that, which Jeremiah had 1 foot pre-exile and 1 foot in exile. Daniel, who we've been going through now, full on in exile from a young age. As a young man, was brought over, and then spent all his days, and from what we know, probably died in Babylon, which had then been taken over by Persia. So we did Daniel chapter 1, and we got introduced to King Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel, and they resolved not to eat, not to be defiled by their king's food.
Yeah.
So we saw something of this beautiful faith and character and commitment even early on. Then Daniel chapter 2, we got the vision of the statue.
Yep.
And the statue had multiple different layers: head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly of bronze, and then the legs of iron, and then the feet of iron mixed with clay.
That's a great memory. I don't think I could go down that list.
Yeah. Well, I love Daniel so much. It's really a big deal. So that happened in Daniel chapter 2, but it was a lot more about God's sovereignty over everything. But as Alec said in his message, Nebuchadnezzar's response to the dream.
Yeah.
His response to God speaking to him specifically through a troubling dream interpreted through an Israelite slave about how God is sovereign and he is not, he decides to build a statue in real life, not in dream life, as big and massive as he could do it, and he decides to make the whole statue, head to toe, gold.
Yeah. Yep.
Which seems like a pretty defiant thing to do.
Certainly.
At least naive.
Yeah, that's something that I loved about Alec's message on Sunday, is specifically how he tied in that connection. Because I think it'd be really easy in reading through Daniel to just miss the fact that there's this big dream and there is a golden head, and now we have this golden statue.
Yeah.
But it seems so clear that it's placed there for you to catch something and be like, oh, like they're drawing a connection and saying, look at this idea of the king wanting to be mighty. Yeah. And then he builds a statue, and it was like 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And so I was digging into that a little bit, because they're like, okay, what might the statue even look like? Yeah. And some scholars are saying like, well, it's probably not a human shape, because the proportions would be way off to be 90 foot tall and 9 feet wide. Okay. But they're like, but it certainly might have like human aspects. Like it could be a head and like on some long post or something like that. Which would fall in line with some of the architectural stuff of that time. Yeah. But
Babylon, they built the hanging gardens of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So we think of Babylon as kind of like this old deserty thing, but Babylon it might have been the greatest, most impressive civilization of all time. Yeah. Based on Daniel's, interpretation of the statue. And so like you go to Paris and you see the built up buildings and the Eiffel Tower and all these parliament buildings and, the bridges that other nations have gifted them. It's one of the most impressive places you can be and witness all of this amazing, amazing work. And that's more like what Babylon was. And Babylon is even more. Yeah. At that point, they had all the gold, they had all the strength, they had all that, and they loved, what we're getting into next week is they worshipped the gods of gold and iron and silver and bronze and wood and stone. And so I think, it's interesting. So that he wanted to build something really impressive and made it all gold. Didn't want to be just the head of gold. Didn't want a little stone come and destroy the statue that became a mountain. That's what the dream was. Right. He was basically saying, no, we're going to be gold forever, and we're never going down. Yeah. And it's kind of defiant of what God was.
You almost think of a parallel, and perhaps because Babylon and Babel, but of this creation of a structure. Absolutely. And the response of like in the dream, God certainly responds with crushing, the statue. But it's interesting then that you see this repeated image of defiance happening where he builds that. And it's clear that he is building something that's massive and gold. So I just imagine what it would look like being hit in the sun. Like it's something definitely meant to dazzling.
Yeah, that's funny. When we were living in Ireland, we got to go over to Paris, me and my wife and my 3 daughters. And we were driving into Paris. We got there late, and we were driving in about like 9:50 p.m. Okay. And we were driving down the Seine River right on the other side of it, and we were going to look for our little Airbnb place. And so we're coming up pretty close to the Eiffel Tower. We're right on the other side of the river. And it was 9:50, and I'd heard that on the hour, so 10 p.m., the whole thing sparkles and dazzles. I just heard it. I'd never seen it. And so I'm driving down this road and I'm just thinking, okay, everybody's tired. We need to get to this place. But in 10 minutes, supposedly something special is going to happen. And we were literally driving right up to the other side. We were just on the other side of the river and there's just traffic everywhere. And I saw this one weird pullout that took us down this thing that was roped off. and I thought, okay, this is one of those hero dad, hero man of my daughters and my wife's life. Like, if I could pull this off, I will be the greatest. And so I pulled off real quick, just looking around for any cops or anybody that was going to yell at us. Nobody was yelling at us. I popped the hood of our rental car like something was wrong and acted like I was looking. I wouldn't know how to fix anything anyway. But I just created this scenario, and it was like 9:58, 9:59, and then all of a sudden, boom, it happened. The whole Eiffel Tower right in front of us with our pretended to be broke down car just started sparkling. And the noises that came out of my daughters were it was like one of the most special moments in my life.
That sounds incredible.
It was really cool.
It
was a hero dad moment for sure. And it worked out.
I was really worried that the story was going to end with nothing happening.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad it went that
And
direction.
then I got arrested and then I was in prison for a couple of days, but no, it was a cool moment. But dazzling, the statue, this amazing thing that they could see from everywhere around. And then it got even weirder. Not just was Nebuchadnezzar building some sort of defiant, oh yeah, God, you think you're tough? You think you can bother me? Boom, I'm building this golden statue. But then he made a law across the entire land that everybody, whenever this certain song was played, was to bow down facing the statue. Which again, there's connotations and, it brings to mind, kind of an Islamic type thing where when a song is played, 7 times a day, under Sharia law, there is a bowing down, probably facing Mecca. I actually am not exactly sure what direction they're facing, but it is interesting in that, because in that, Middle East part of land, here's this song being played, and every time it's to be played, you're to bow down facing the statue. That seems a little intense.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say that the repeated bowing for me would be so much intense. Certainly because it's to the image that he has set up.
Yeah.
But I even think of church bells, perhaps, and the early
call to worship.
Exactly. And so you would have, even just throughout the day, I think that having bells ringing out from the church marking the hours. I was reading Opening to God by David Benner recently, and he even talks about in that way, like it's so useful to have repetitions that call us into prayer. And so it's like, I certainly see, like, it's certainly religious is the thing that's happening here. And of course, the image being set up as religious. And so I'd say that the repetition for me, I'd say it really denotes that. And we certainly see the imagery of like, okay, he's doing something even as the king, being religious and trying to, as we're going to talk about, I suppose, like worship this image.
Yeah.
And what does that contain?
Yeah.
Right. But I'd say especially as believers, perhaps we could get better at having regular times throughout the day where we're called to pray.
Interesting. So you're actually using this idea from Nebuchadnezzar to say, hey, we should be better at calling ourselves to worship throughout the day, which I've never really heard that take on that, but I get what you're saying.
Certainly.
For sure.
I don't think it's by any means an interpretation of the text. I'd like to be clear on that. Certainly not an exegesis there.
That's not what the message we're supposed to be drawing.
No. But
it is. Yeah. There's one. I think the word worship. He says you must worship the image, and one is what was happening in Nebuchadnezzar's heart that he would decide to do this. I mean, one is just a simple thing of what kind of egomaniac, are we dealing with here that literally would make a law and say, if you don't, you're going to be thrown into a furnace, you're going to be executed if you don't bow down and worship this image. And, it doesn't say that it's an image of Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
Which is interesting. It doesn't really say what the image is. It's just an image of gold, and it's a statue. So, I think there is something human about it. And it's interesting what you were saying, some of that background about the makeup of it doesn't fit our normal understanding of what we would think. But it's definitely an object to represent the image of the glory of Babylon.
Yes.
The glory of Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
Everyone is supposed to stop and bow in submission, bow in acknowledgement, bow in allegiance, bow in, maybe affection. I don't know.
Right.
But basically it's when we talk about Nebuchadnezzar wanted everyone to worship this thing, and he used a song to stimulate that.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions is I've been trying to figure out, what does it mean to worship in that regard?
Yeah.
And you're drawing out saying, well, I think even in our Christian life, there's music. Obviously, we use that every Sunday in church or in small groups or whatever, or even in our own worship or times of prayer. It can be very stirring. I love when Elijah said, "Oh, you want to hear from the Lord? Bring me a harpist."
Yeah.
And he played the harp, and then he could hear from the Lord. There's something amazing about music,
certainly,
that does almost like open a window between heaven and earth, or open a window between spirit and not spirit, which is a little creepy, but
well, it makes me think there's a quote that is often attributed to St. Augustine. I'm not sure if it's actually him, but it says, "He who sings prays twice." And God has done something interesting where he has ordained that like music and something about that art like does connect our hearts in a way, perhaps even in the releasing of our prayers that we might not otherwise have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is interesting. Well, and then to think about how music is just, it's everything. And it stirs people to not just prayer and holy things.
Yeah.
It stirs people to all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Too. But it definitely stirs the soul. There's no doubt about that. And so Nebuchadnezzar was basically putting together a worship service. Let's stir the soul with some music. And then the response was this acknowledgement and allegiance to this God he created. And again, whether it's just the image of the glory of Babylon, or if it's the image of Marduk, which was the Babylonian god, whether it's the image of Nebuchadnezzar, or somehow some conflation of all of them, where Nebuchadnezzar began to think, well, maybe I am Marduk, or maybe the glory of Babylon is connected to me, or maybe I am God's son. I mean, we don't know tons of stuff about that. We know from Assyrian writings and Babylonian writings, they really loved themselves. Yeah. And they didn't really tell the truth about their weaknesses or even their failures in battles or anything like that. They were not truthful. They just were always about appearances. Yeah.
I think that you're drawing out about the power of Babylon is a really great point too, because there's absolutely an element to this worship that's really political. Because with the Babylonians, and I think kind of borrowing from the Assyrians and stuff, like when they would capture peoples, it wasn't always and now you have to forsake all of your gods. It was really an addition kind of thing, right? Yeah. Like it's like, okay. And so when you have Nebuchadnezzar setting up this statue and saying worship, he's not doing a monotheistic kind of thing and saying, this is the only one you worship now. But he's really saying like, okay, regardless of what you believe, and it's a universal call because he says it's like all the officials and everyone. Yeah. It's like, if you hear this, like you bow to this. And so it's really like, I think it's both interesting, even as you're portraying that kind of image of God, king kind of stuff, because it is both deeply religious and political, and him trying to get a universal obedience and allegiance from the people.
Well, and so that's where, in my mind, this is the stuff that hasn't made it in the sermons, and maybe people will see why on a Sunday morning. But I've had this kind of haunting question in the back of mind, and the way that it's phrased is, so when the national song was played, everyone was supposed to pledge allegiance. And so then, obviously, last podcast we talked about, is America Babylon or whatever, and I mean, the simple answer is no. America's America, Babylon's Babylon. But, is Babylon's an empire, America's an empire. Yeah. Babylon is a conglomeration of human power that does stand, if not in opposition, at least in the way of the kingdom of God and God's sovereign power. And just like that little stone, which was Jesus and his kingdom, came and did away with the kingdoms of earth, America will also fall, but before the sovereignty of God, no doubt about it. And hopefully there's something of the kingdom that's been built here that will last, no doubt about it. And America was built on some really great biblical values. I don't know if that's true of Babylon, at least not biblical values. We know that as far as the canon goes. But so then, this time that question has just been there. So in this image, a national song was played and people were supposed to pledge allegiance.
Yeah.
And so is it possible that in America, we have gotten to a place as Christians where when a national song is played, we pledge allegiance in a way that is inappropriate, in a way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Azariah, Ananiah, and Mishael, in a way that they wouldn't, or they would have had a check in their spirit saying, hey, you know what? I don't pledge allegiance to this. Now, we know that they worked for the good of Babylon, no doubt about it. And actually, even in this next chapter we're getting into this week, Daniel is so grieved at any pain that would come to Nebuchadnezzar. He's so heartbroken that there's some hard things coming for Nebuchadnezzar, which is like Nebuchadnezzar is a ruthless, egomaniac, horrible leader in so many ways, and yet Daniel loves him. Even to grieve something negative that would happen to him. Yet, in our story that Alex shared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they did not bow. Yeah. There was something in their soul that just said, I don't pledge allegiance to this.
Right.
And so that's the question. And that's a troubling question because obviously, with Colin Kaepernick in particular, he bowed, or he would kneel when the national anthem was played, but that was in basically, defiance or saying, I don't believe America is good and I don't like America and I don't pledge allegiance to America. I'm not trying to, that's a completely different imagery and a different stream of consciousness than what I'm saying. But like where is for God and country become too much God and country and not just God? And yeah, we do love our country, but God and country are not on an equal footing.
Certainly.
So that's the apotheosis, which is a bit of what I wrote about. What are some thoughts on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think exactly kind of what you wrote when you wrote on apotheosis, and then also just some of the conversations I've had with you previously, just talking about this necessity of priority. And you have to know where are your priorities. And if your priority is country before God, it's like, okay, then you've got that really, really wrong. And so we certainly set our priorities first. It's God above all else. And you are I guess we're waiting for our future citizenship that's also present in some ways, but of the kingdom of heaven. And so it's like your first priority is to that. And then the second one, you could make your whole order off that. I'm not going to go into the specific details of perhaps that.
Family, church,
right,
whatever,
exactly. But then I think more specifically when we start to bring in questions about what about like the Pledge of Allegiance, and we can look at these things and we say, are we pledging like to the flag? And what does that even mean? And so you look at the term pledge and its, I guess, basest form, it would just be like a deep promise. It's like, do we have any do we have any problems with commitments or promises? I'd say at face value, certainly not. It depends on what you're promising, right? Yeah. And so I think it comes back to that, what are you promising? And is it something that comes in conflict with another value or a rule that you were supposed to follow as a believer? Yeah.
Well, I think, another image that flashes in my mind when I'm thinking about this same story of the people bowing to this image is the Heil Hitler, right? So there was this point at which, in the modern era, that there was a guy who rose to, an egomaniac kind of everybody do this, thrown into a fiery furnace, gas chamber if you don't do this or if you're not. There's some eerie connotations there. Obviously, history, we can see 2020. It's hard to see what but the Heil Hitler and everybody, and you see those images where everyone's just like all in, and particularly Bonhoeffer, but other people too. They were saying no,
right?
No,
yeah.
Wake up! You are pledging allegiance to God and country. You think your conflation or your syncretism now is become totally unholy to where you're not even serving the God who is God, but now you've just made your country your God. And so it's very possible for us to do. And I guess my whole thing, that this is what I'm personally taking away from this wrestling behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Again, it's not even coming out in a sermon at this point. But wrestling behind the scenes is, I just always want there to be, every time I put my hand over my heart and I pledge allegiance, I want there to be a check.
Mm-hmm.
I want there to be something in me that doesn't sit quite right. And that doesn't mean I don't pledge allegiance to this country that has taken good care of me and I want to take good care of it. This American experiment that I believe is a really good way to try and conglomerate and configurate human power.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's human, so it's both good and bad. I'm not giving it 100% passing grade.
Right. Yep.
But I think the ideals, especially in the Constitution and all of those things, are very biblical and aspirational ideals that we need to keep fighting for and all of those things. So, I mean, totally.
Yep.
100%.
Right.
At the same time, I want, whenever someone says, put your hand over your heart and pledge allegiance,
mm-hmm.
I want there to be something in me that goes, you what?
Yes.
You're like, hold on a minute. I need to give this a thought because of the 10 Commandments, because God very clearly says, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no images.
Yeah.
You shall
certainly.
not bow down. That's what Alec brought out in Deuteronomy
Right.
chapter 6 and Exodus 20, when you shall not bow down. I mean, that was such, and as a Hebrew boy growing up, there was one thing you knew was the 10 Commandments, right?
Yep.
You knew you shall not bow down. So when someone's saying bow down, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, they said, I don't really bow down to things. And so this guy's asking me about, and they were able to say, I'm not bowing down to this.
Right.
Putting our hand over our heart is not necessarily bowing down to something, but pledging allegiance.
Certainly.
Dan Riccio, who we all love and he always talks about faith. A definition of faith is probably allegiance, is one way to really, some people think it's like a mental assent, but he said it probably has a lot more to do with allegiance, especially according to Paul in his writings. And so that allegiance, it's a commitment, it's a promise towards something. So I think whenever the national anthem is sung, I love the national anthem. I love our flag. I love putting my hand over my heart and saying, I'm proud to be American. I love this country. I want this country to do well. I want this country to turn to the Lord and see the hand of the Lord's grace upon us continued. But anytime that national anthem's sung is, and after reading Daniel, there's this part of me that goes, okay, check the priorities.
Yep.
Okay. There's a slight hesitation. I think that's such a good thing for a believer to have.
Absolutely. And I think even you bringing out that point of looking back to Bonhoeffer and Nazi Germany, like, you're so right, because there was an actual conflation of worshiping kind of country and worshiping God. In fact, I was looking into it and I found a quote by one of the Nazi leaders, and it's for their Nazi youth program, and it said, if we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler, the Führer, serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God. And so right there you see that, it's like, okay, whoa, like,
serious.
That's a prioritization. That's like, they literally put Germany and then God.
Well, I'm gonna get real dangerous here, but please hear me out. To try and just bring it a little to our context. And I'm not trying to say we're Babylon or we're Germany or anything like that, but when a presidential figure or someone trying to be elected says, if you don't vote for me, you're not this, and what he said in that situation is, if you don't vote for a Democrat, then you're not black, or something like that. And those, I'm not trying to make more out of that, and please don't say it, but when somebody says something like that, it's beginning to be this conflation where your identity now needs to be tied in with your politic. And if you're not, if you're not identifying as this and acting in kind, then you're not with us. Which America, the whole point of America is individual liberties. So we all get to think and decide on our own. We don't have to, fall into a party line. But now that's kind of what's happening. But then you think of Donald Trump as well, and there's this egotistical, I'm saying the word wrong, but it's funny because he's selling Bibles, and it's like I don't know exactly what makes this guy tick, but there are all kinds of red flags as far as character and some of those things that just make me go, we have to be careful right now. Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to say I'm better than either of these guys, or we shouldn't vote for one of these guys,
right?
Or Robert Kennedy or whoever gets in there. Like we got to vote for somebody,
sure.
And there's some values and policies behind them that we can process and feel like this candidate has a vision for America, or a vision for policies and things that I'm more in line with or not aligned with. We're not going to find a perfect candidate. I understand all of those things, but I do think that. We always have to be, as Christians, kind of this, prudent resistor.
Yep.
Where we're just always processing and saying, my citizenship first is in heaven, my allegiance first is to Christ, and then subsequent to that, and it has to be clearly subsequent to that. Then I make my decisions, and I feel like. But both, all the parties right now are calling for almost blind allegiance.
Yep.
Like if you don't follow me and everything I say 100%, you're standing in the way. And it's like, well, no, I'm not going to agree with anybody 100%. I don't think. So I feel like there's a little bit of that push and tension in our culture today that we just need to be aware of.
There certainly is, and I think it's like, even when you look at the commands to obedience in Scripture, right? And I believe it is Philippians that actually points out that our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. But there's this really interesting thing, and perhaps even looking back to Dan Riccio speaking about allegiance in faith, that when we have allegiance towards something, we act towards it. And there's a really tight-knit, I suppose, unity between how we act and what we believe and what we say that we believe and what we have allegiance to. Yeah. And so we have to be really careful, as you were just pointing out, like when we speak about authority, or if we mix identity with ourselves in politics. Like we see in Scripture, it's very clear, like our identity proceeds from God. And so the identity proceeding from God and perhaps our allegiance to Him should influence the way we actually act. And we've got to be very careful that, just as you were saying with the pledge, and we check ourselves, and even perhaps we check ourselves and say, how often am I renewing my devotion and pledge even to God? Like how often am I checking in the Pledge of Allegiance and saying like, okay, I need to like renew my heart with God, and just say like, yeah, absolutely.
Dalton, I said a lot right there, and I'm not even saying I'm right in all these things. It's just processing out loud. But is there a little cleanup needs to happen?
No, but I have like a little bit of pushback personally.
Please.
Just a different perspective here. I think like this, there's a couple different thoughts that come up, so I'm just going to try to be succinct or just pick the one that I really want to say. But I definitely think it's really hard. Like, I guess one thing that I would challenge is like, okay, so there's this prioritization of my allegiance to my nation or my faith in my religion, or, in this case for us, Jesus, right? So, I guess like the one thing I would push back or maybe challenge on is like, okay, well, in my heart, if I'm saying the Pledge of Allegiance and I know that my priority list is always Jesus above that, the action of doing that, like outwardly facing to other people, like couldn't we, because we had made a point and like, okay, they probably could have bowed, in Babylon. Yeah. And they probably could have had that prioritization in their heart. My allegiance is to God, but not Babylon, or God first and then Babylon, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I guess to me, my challenge is like, there's a lot. Like, what we're saying is there's a lot in the action of doing it.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess it's one of those things where it's like, well, the people that just won't understand, you can't handshake your patriotism and your Jesus, I'll say for right now, you know?
Yeah.
Like, maybe those people that don't get it, don't get it.
Yeah.
To me, I always, like, once I was, you know, mature in my faith, I always thought it was kind of weird that we pledged allegiance every morning in elementary school and high school. Like, it just seems a little weird. And I'm definitely not saying that this is Nazi, like, you know, a parallel to Nazism and Hitler. I'm not saying that. But it is this weird thing that happens, and maybe the action within itself actually does say a lot more than what we think. Now, I'm not saying, because you had brought up Kaepernick, you know, again, another challenge or another visual is like, okay, well, if I truly believe that the national anthem, like, was not a priority to me as a Christian, and I knelt for that, the action is Kaepernick and I, as a Jesus follower, kneeling. And outwardly, what does that look like to people? Well, in my heart, it's because I have a priority list. But to Kaepernick, it's you know, I don't agree with, like, the racial injustice in America right now. I don't necessarily like the legislation. I know I'm rambling a little bit.
No,
but
no.
Am I making myself clear?
Yeah.
Like, within that action, I guess my question is, like, what's the line or the threshold? And does it exist? Maybe it doesn't, or maybe it's really hard.
One thing you made me think of when you were saying that is, I forget the guy's name that came. I think he was from Assyria, and he came to Elisha, I think, and he was a leper, and he was a general in the army of Assyria, and they had heard about a healer in Israel. And so the king said, "Why don't you go and find out?" So he comes to him, and when he gets there, Naaman the Syrian, and he gets there, and is it Elijah or Elisha?
It is Elisha.
Elisha says, "Okay, if you want to be healed, go wash 7 times in the Jordan River." And Naaman is like, "What? I got beautiful rivers where I come from. You want me to go wash in that dirty Israeli river?" And he's upset, he's frustrated, and so he just leaves. And that's the end of the interaction with Elisha. And then on his way, one of Naaman's servants says to him, "Why don't you just go wash, man? What do you got to lose? You have leprosy. You just got to dip 7 times. It doesn't work, whatever." So he goes and does it, dips 7 times, bam, he's healed. And then he comes back to Elisha, and he says, you know, "Whoa," and I think he gave him a bunch of clothes or something like that. But then he says, "What I'm going to do is I'm going to take dirt from Israel, and I'm going to go back, and every time that we're supposed to worship the gods of Assyria, I'm going to put the Israeli dirt down, and I'm going to bow on that." And Elisha says to him, "That's cool." Even though obviously it means nothing, right? It's just dirt. But Elisha said, "Your heart's in the right place, man. Your heart's in the right place." And we know everything God is after is our heart, right? And so so my pushback on your pushback, I think your pushback is totally legitimate. It's totally legitimate. Yeah. Because I think like you said, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they could have just bowed and still kept their integrity and kept all those things and been right before the Lord and all these things. But we have the story because they didn't.
Right, yeah.
Because they did stand against something. And so we as Christians, we need to take that seriously.
Right.
And be very careful what we pledge allegiance to, what we bow down to, what we publicly affirm. I mean, there is something very powerful about us standing against those things, and even getting ourselves in a lot of trouble. And Jesus' life was full of that as well. But I do think our heart is what God's looking at, and if we're saying, "Hey, 100%, I'm pledging allegiance as far as like 5th level allegiance,"
right.
And I'm a kid in a school or whatever. Like I don't think we need to start teaching people that's an evil thing to do. But your pushback is legitimate to say maybe.
And maybe that's like my anxiety is like the condition of, humanity is like none of us know truly what's going on in here, for better or worse. So there is this kind of cultural norm where if you don't follow the norm, because I'm afraid there's a lot of people, like I'm going to be very broad sweeping here, but like a lot of conservative Christian Americans that had a problem with Kaepernick kneeling for the anthem, right? But if we were to do that, if the government was saying do this and don't follow, do this in place of following Jesus, like I'm afraid that there's a certain sector of kind of so much politics intertwined with the Bible, Jesus, Christianity, that there would be kind of why aren't you like standing for the anthem? And it's like, well, because, there's a choice here. I just feel like my anxiety comes from that outward kind of like, oh, I'm not following the norm. Right. Now people have a sweeping generalization of a person, of who I am as a person.
And that's where, I think you got to rely on the Spirit. And if the Spirit's putting a check in your heart about putting your hand over your heart during a national anthem, don't do it. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you hate America and you're out there burning flags.
But you understand the nuance way too much.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Like totally.
That, like not a lot of people have an understanding of that nuance, and it gets conflated.
And you got to live
for
with
better
that.
or worse.
And that's where when you picture Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah standing there.
Right.
I mean, it's in my mind, it is the funniest scene in the world where, they're just kind of standing there and everyone's bowing down, and the people bowing down around them are like, what are they doing? And they're just standing there going, like, I don't know what to do with my hands right now. They're just so awkward and out there until finally, we don't, like, the way it makes it sound is it must have happened multiple times, because some of the Chaldeans went and told the king, hey, those Hebrews are doing this. They don't love you. They don't hate you. So it's like, and then they eventually find him, and then he calls them and says, hey, or, why aren't you doing this? And they're like, well, we're not going to bow down. Yeah. Doesn't matter what. And some of the beautiful words like, and even if the Lord doesn't save us, King, we're not bowing down to you, man.
And I want to make myself super clear on the record. I am not anti-America. I am not anti-Pledge of Allegiance or national anthem or anything, just to make myself clear. But I think just like with what we do with liturgy and religious practices, if we lose the meaning behind them and like the meaning, or maybe even the lack of meaning, like that, I think it's just important to always reconsider what we do as Christians, especially as Christians, the norms we follow, for better or worse, the things that we think are good things, virtuous things to do, or obviously not.
The theological words is orthodoxy needs to match orthopraxy. Yeah. Like, your right thinking is great, but if it doesn't match your right acting, then it's not great. Then there's an incoherence there, and so that's where the Spirit, your Spirit, and the Spirit of God can work these things out and show you how to walk in a way that doesn't violate whatever the Spirit is doing. But that doesn't necessarily mean every place has to do the exact same thing. Yeah. I mean, there's some things, yes. There's a universal reality to, sin in this regard, but then in some of those core convictions about, whether to, pledge allegiance, whether to bow, whether to do those things, I think that's something that you and the Spirit have to work out, and you have to be willing to stand out if that's the case.
And I think it's so true, and it comes down to even some of those questions about not causing a brother to stumble, right? Because we acknowledge that there are certain convictions that are going to hit us more deeply than they're going to hit other people. And so that, and even I think briefly, just speaking specifically about the postures, whether it's bowing down or a hand over our heart, I'd be really intrigued to dive into some of the cultural aspects of it and say, do we today invest as much meaning in our symbols, embodied symbols, that they would back then? And I would probably personally argue that the intensity of their embodied symbols and bowing and stuff is going to be probably a little bit more felt in their culture. I think, again, bowing would be super weird to us today.
Or standing for the national anthem, as out of respect and reverence, whereas theirs was bowing.
Yeah, and I think just in their culture, those postures probably communicated more to them than ours do to us, which doesn't mean that we should fall on one side or the other necessarily. Right. I think that second aspect for sure of checking that own personal heart conviction. And I think really, as you were kind of mentioning at the end there, we'd be remiss if we didn't say like why these three like were able to stand. And it's because their allegiance was built upon such a firm faith in God that they were able to say, and Daniel, like, we know that our God can rescue us.
Right, yeah.
But even if he doesn't,
right.
We know what we're supposed to do.
Absolutely. And the result of that, right, you look at the next chapter, and one of the headings, at least in the ESV, in the next chapter is Nebuchadnezzar praises God.
Totally.
And so there's something
Don't
about...
steal my thunder for this Sunday, man. That's what I'm preaching. I'm so excited about it.
Tim, what are you doing?
Yeah, you'll have to cut that.
Well, to wrap this up, Alex's message wrapped up. Basically, he said, how were they able to stand? And he took us back to the Torah, Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 6, and basically said that these boys knew from the moment they were born, the first commandment is, have no other gods before me, which, Exodus 20 expounds on that and says, you shall not bow to any other God. And so for them, that's just, ringing in their ear, you shall not bow, you shall not bow, you shall not bow, you shall not bow. Now someone's telling me to bow to this thing and worship it, and they're like, no, I ain't going to do it. And then he went to Deuteronomy 6, and he basically unpacked how, that there in Deuteronomy 6, it talks about fearing God, loving, trusting God, and loving God. And so I just want to finish with fear of the God, because ultimately that's what we're after, even more so than fear of wrongly elevating our allegiance to other things. Yeah. That can be challenging or confusing and maybe even a little personal. But what isn't is if we just focus on fearing God. And that's true throughout the whole scriptures, wisdom literature, Old Testament, New Testament. Fear of the Lord is something that we are supposed to have and carry. And that needs a little explaining because, are we supposed to be afraid of God? Like he's going to beat us if we do things wrong? But I love that he added trust and love, because that, I think, better it kind of fills out what it means to fear the Lord. There is that understanding how big he is and how small we are. There is a humility, there is a reverence, there is a awe, there is a don't speak too quick, don't speak too loud, don't make too many sudden movements in his presence in some ways, because he is awesome. Yes. Yet at the same time, it's not just that. It's also he is Father, he is trustworthy, he is compassionate. His eye is on the sparrow. He knows what you need. He gives good gifts to those that ask. So there's a trust reality to where his character, even though he is able to snuff us out in a minute, he doesn't. Right. He doesn't willy-nilly wipe people out in that regard. And then even to get to that point where part of fear of the Lord is to love him. Is to really love him. And it's even when you think about in marriage, my wife can hurt me more than anyone in the world. Not because she's physically capable, she's puny. I could take her in independent. I tell her all the time or whatever. I hug her and be like, why are you so small? And she's like, get out of here. But love is creating a vulnerability too. Yeah, right. And so because I love her, because I've given everything, because I've made her, so special in my life, like she could hurt me really much, but that's the love. Like, if it doesn't break your heart, it isn't love. Sorry, John Foreman quote, that was sneaky. But I love the way he did that. He talked about fear of God, trust God, and love God. You want to finish us off with anything along those lines?
I had a friend recently who I was talking to about the fear of God. And I don't know how much he had dug into the topic recently, but he was looking into it, and he was like, he could read the scriptures and say like, okay, fear God, but like, what does that really mean? And it's the beginning of wisdom, but also like we've got such our cultural connotation of fear, and you got like, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the Almighty, but like, so what do you do with this? And I believe it's actually Luther who has a really beautiful distinction between a servile fear and a filial fear. And the servile fear of being the fear of a servant, or perhaps fear of torture or torment or punishment. Yeah. But then you have the fear, a filial fear, the fear perhaps of a son or a child or in the family, of just like a respect.
Yeah.
And almost a delight. It's like you don't want to mess up because you don't want your father to be displeased, because your love is so great, your respect is so great that turning from that would be something that would be fearful to you. It's like, I really don't want that. And so I think even
it's weird to think that we could hurt God.
Right. Yeah.
By turning away.
Yeah.
And not wanting to do that. No, I think that's interesting. What did you say? It's the filial?
Filial.
Filial.
Yeah. So that probably from the Latin, probably like filius, son, right? Yeah. But yeah, that more family kind of love, I suppose, in some ways, especially looking at the depiction of God as Father. And I think that ropes in really beautiful some of the imagery of what does love look like when it pertains to fear. Or even to that end, you could say, I think in Ecclesiastes 12:13, I think sometimes it's rendered fear God and honor his commandments, for this is the wholeness of mankind. Right? And so there's also this aspect of like, okay, if you fear God, like, how do we know that we love God? And so if we obey his commandments.
That's what Jesus said. If you love me, obey my commandments.
Exactly.
That's what my dad used to say. I love you, Dad. Obey my commandments. He used to say that all the time. So weird. But yeah, there's a connection there.
There's certainly a connection between fear and love in that sense. Yeah. And that, even as we're talking about today, leads us to embody right actions, to lean into orthopraxy, as you said. Yeah.
Well, that'll wrap it up for us today. We obviously talked about a lot of things there. We'd love to hear any feedback or questions. You know, you don't have to shout and scream in the comment sections or whatever, or emails, but just to say, hey, yeah, here's a little pushback I had on this, or yeah, that was helpful and encouraging. Anything. We'd love to hear back if possible. And always you can, spread the word on these things, trying to get more people to be able to listen to this if you find them helpful. But thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dalton. And looking forward to this Sunday getting into Daniel chapter 4 and 5. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream.
There you go,
Daniel's on the scene. So it'll be good. But God bless you all. Drive safe if you're driving. And talk to you later.